Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Bamidbar, Tavshin Pei Hey. And we're going to discuss, actually going to share with you, the introduction to the commentary of Hamek Dover, written by the Nitziv Harav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Nitziv is an acronym for the initials of his name. He was the last Rosh Yeshiva of the famous Volozhin Yeshiva. And in his commentary on the Torah, he has a very interesting discussion in his introduction to the book of Bamidbar, which is what we're starting. And he points out that based on the Gemara, the Talmud in Sota refers to the book of Bamidbar, what we call the book of Bamidbar, refers to it as Chumash HaPikudim. The Chumash means a fifth. There's 5 books, so each one is called a Chumash, a fifth. It's called Chumash HaPikudim, the Chumash of numbers, of counting. We have, in this week's Parsha, the Jewish people are counted. And later on in Parshas Pinchas, which is about 40 years later, the Jewish people are counted again. So our sages decided to call this book of the Torah the book of counting. And the book of countings. And it's these countings that seem to make a very strong impression on our sages, more than all the other episodes that take place in this book. And there's a lot of them. You have the sin of the spies, you have Korach, you have the blessings of Bilam. There's so much in the book of Bamidbar, and what seemed to have made a mark on them were the countings. And the question is, why? What is so important about the countings that they named the whole Sefer after that? And the Nitziv explains, because these 2 countings represent something very important that was happening to the Jewish people. And that is that while the Jewish people were in the desert, they were living in a state of what is called Tiferes, glory, a state under the leadership of Moshe, which was completely supernatural. They survived in a desert supernaturally. The food fell from heaven. The water came from a rock that traveled around with them. They had 7 clouds of glory surrounding them. Their entire existence was supernatural. Their entire existence is called glory because they were always sitting there with Hashem with them. It was very clear. If you live with supernatural, Hashem is there. There were no secrets as to what that Hashem was with them and Hashem was leading them, which makes it even more hard to understand the sins that they committed. But this is how they lived, a supernatural existence. Existence that is an existence where Hashem is, so to speak, right there, clearly with them. But once they entered the land of Israel, that was all meant to stop. When they entered the land of Israel, they were meant to live a natural life. Agriculture, work the land, sell your crops, eat your crops, sell your crops. They were meant to live a natural existence. An existence in which they understand that Hashem is always running everything. You don't necessarily see it. It's not as clear as when things were in the desert. But they're meant to live a natural existence. And in essence, what happens here in the book of Bamidbar is a transition. That where the Jewish people are transitioning from this state of living, a state living in a miraculous state, they're transitioning into a natural state. And the Nitziv says in Parashas Chukas, which is 40 years later, we already find the Jewish people, they're not out of the desert, they're still living with the mun, they still have the miracles, but at the same time, they're actually fighting regular wars. They're already starting to live a natural existence, which the Nitziv implies, and as many commentaries do, that the original plan of entering the land of Israel would have been a miraculous takeover of Israel too. The sin of the spies took care of that, as he will explain, as we will talk about. And then eventually the Jewish people began that transition with the wars, with Sichon, with Og, conquering the land on the other side of the Jordan. All this was already doing things in a natural state because the transition went slowly, or it went in stages. The Jewish people were at one point kind of in between, and then eventually they would enter the land of Israel, where they would live that natural state and fight natural wars. So there's a transition that's going on here from the state of living in can't find the right word, but living a miraculous state with God right there, clearly, into a state where they lived a natural life, believing in God, being able to see the hand of God in many ways in their natural life, but not living with miracles on a constant basis. And the Netziv points out that this is actually a medrash, a fascinating medrash in Bereshis Rabbah. In Bereshis Rabbah, you have the medrash that's going on the first day of creation, where Hashem creates light. And the word light appears 5 times in that verse. And the medrash says that each time the verse talks about light, it's corresponding to one of the 5 books of the Torah. So the medrash says, when the verse says, "Vayomer Elokim yehi or," Hashem said, "Let there be light." It says Sefer Bereshis, Keneged Sefer Bereshis. This corresponds to the book of Bereshis. That's when Hashem created His world. Vayehi or, then again it says, "And there was light." Keneged Sefer Shmos, that corresponds to the book of Shmos. Shabayatzu Yisrael me'afei l'loira. It was in that book the Jewish people went from darkness to light, out of Egypt to the Mishkan receiving the Torah. Vayar Elokim es ha'or ki tov. Hashem saw the light that it was good. Keneged Sefer Vayikra, this corresponds to the book of Vayikra. Shumalei halachas rabbis, filled with many laws. Then, Vayavdel Elokim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech, and God separated between the light and the darkness. Keneged Sefer Bamidbar, that corresponds to the book of Bamidbar. Shumavdel ben Yotzei Mitzrayim l'boy haaretz, which separates between those who left Egypt and those who came to the land. And Vayikra Elokim l'or yom, the last time it says or, light in the pasuk, where it says Hashem called light day, that corresponds to the book of Devarim. So we're going to focus on where it says that the pasuk that says Hashem separated between light and darkness corresponds to the book of Bamidbar. That says the Medrash says because it was a separation between those who left Egypt and those who came to the land. That means one of them represents light and one of them represents darkness. Says the Netziv, the light are those who left Egypt. They lived in the light. They lived a miraculous state. God's presence was clear. That's light. The land of Israel was darkness in the sense that you're living a natural existence without being able to see God so clearly. And that is a transition taking place in the book of Bamidbar. Now, he points out that this transition is really demonstrated in the differences that we find in the counting and the census in our parsha, and then 40 years later in Parshas Pinchas. In our parsha, we'll see that the Jewish people are counted by tribe, and they're also counted by camp. The Jewish people had 12 tribes, but they had 4 camps. Each camp consisted of 3 tribes. So first we have a counting by tribes, and then we have a counting of the Jewish people by camp, where the Torah talks about each camp, which was actually led by a specific tribe. It again goes through counting all 3 tribes and then giving a census of the camp, doing this 4 times until again it comes out with the same number at the end. But there's 2 countings here, and there's a specific counting as a camp. And then Netziv says that counting as a camp has to be seen as the Jewish people being the chariot of Hashem's presence, because the 4 camps were camping around the Shechina, around the Mishkan. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, is called the Machne Shechina, the camp of the Shechina. The 4 camps around it represent the Merkava, the chariot of Hashem. This counting that the Jewish people had now was a counting that represented. It was a counting that worked together with the state of being that they were. They were in a state of being the chariot of God. When God is so clear in their presence, with all the miracles happening daily, their existence is they are the chariot of God. And the counting of the Jewish people then was a honor to Hashem of counting those who make up his chariot. But in Parshas Pinchas, all we have is a counting of the Jewish people by tribe. Because they're already transitioning into nature, into a natural state of being. The Jewish people actually, that counting in Parashas Pinchas was accounting to know how many Jewish people there are when they're going to enter the land of Israel. Makes a big difference. We know that the amount of land each tribe got was based on the size. But that's it. That's the only counting there is. There is no counting by camps. Because the whole idea of camps wasn't relevant anymore. It still existed at that point of time where they were there, but it wasn't relevant. It wasn't relevant to the counting. Because the Jewish people are transitioning out of that state into a natural state. He also points out another interesting difference between the two is the fact that in our parsha, when the tribes are counted and we get to the tribe of Yosef, the tribe of Ephraim is counted first. Actually, in the beginning of the parsha, when it talks about the princes, the tribe of Ephraim is mentioned first. In parsha, that's by this counting. By the counting in place of Parshas Pinchas, Menashe is mentioned first. Why is that? So he explains. He explains that, as we know, Yaakov blessed his grandchildren. Yosef originally had Menashe by the older son by Yaakov's right hand to receive the right hand blessing, which should belong to the Bachar, the firstborn, who was the greater one. And Ephraim was on the left side. Yaakov switched his hands to put his right hand on Ephraim and the left hand on Menashe. So the Netziv explains, or the Netziv asks a question, which is a famous question: why did Yaakov switch his hands? If things were not in order, he should have changed their positions. He should have moved Menashe to the left and Ephraim to the right. Says the Netziv, the reason he didn't do that is because that's not what he wanted. He wanted Menashe at his right side with his right hand on Ephraim. The right hand on Ephraim, the Netziv says, the hands represent spirituality. And the right hand on Ephraim means that in a spiritual sense, in spiritual matters, Ephraim is greater. Yoshua, the disciple of Moshe, became the next Torah leader of the generation. He passed on the tradition, the oral law, to the next generation. But he wanted Menashe on the right by his leg, because the legs represent physicality, material. When it came to material, Menashe was greater. And therefore, he wanted Menashe on his right side, because Menashe is the greater one when it comes to the material blessing. The spiritual blessing, Ephraim is the greater one. Says the Netziv, that's why you have Ephraim in our parsha is first. Because when we're counting, the Jewish people's counting now, it's not a physical counting, it's not a counting for physical purposes, it's for spiritual purposes. It's as part of the chariot of God. And therefore, Ephraim's first, because when it comes to spirituality, he's greater. But in Parshas Pinchas, when the counting is when the Jewish people then are already transitioning into a natural state, to be in a natural state of the land of Israel. So Menashe is first, because when it comes to the physical leadership, the physical greatness, Menashe is first. So the point that the Netziv is saying is that each one of these two countings represent the state of the Jewish people and the transition that took place, which, as we saw in the Medrash, is what the theme of the book of Bamidbar is about. The book of Bamidbar is about distinguishing separating between those who left Egypt, those who went to the land of Israel, going from the state of miraculous living to natural living. And these two differences are manifest in the countings. So therefore, our sages call them the book of countings, because the countings represent, the countings manifest this different state of the Jewish people and their transition. The first counting is their original state in a state of miraculous living. And then the second shows that change of going into the natural state of things. Now, the Hamak Davar Netziv then mentions something very interesting that's really relevant to Parshas Baloscha. And in Parshas Baloscha, Perhaps you've noticed, we only see it, it only comes once a year, one time in the Torah. But in the middle of Parshas Baloscha, there is a point where you'll see this in the Chumashim and in the Sefer Torah. You have a upside down backwards letter nun, a large letter nun that's upside down and facing in the different direction that a nun typically does. Right? You've got the letter nun that faces to the left, and here you have the nun that's facing to the right, and it's upside down. And then after that, there are two verses. Actually, one of them is a verse that we say every time we take out the Torah, Vahi ben Saran v'Mer Moshe, and another verse. Then another upside down inverted nun, and then continues. So our sages say that those nun represent a separate book, which means that the book of Bamidbar really has within it 3 books, or 3 sections, 3 recordings. You've got up to that point, then you've got like this separate section in the middle, and then you have a 3rd section. And what he explains that to mean is the first section represents the Jewish people in their state of miracle. And then you've got the next state, which is after the second nun, where that's already the point of transition. But it's a point of transition that's a little bit too early. We spoke about this tradition that took place 40 years later, or at the end of 40 years, towards the end of 40 years, after the sin of the spies. The Netziv explains that this transition into a natural state of living was something that was supposed to happen, but the Jewish people, on their own, in a certain way, started trying to live that way. And he explains that in Parashas Baloscha, after that second nun, is the misonanim, those who complained. And it says they complained in the ears of God, it was evil, and a fire came and burned them. There was an immediate, severe punishment for what they did. And they understood that was because that when you live in a miraculous state, you're, so to speak, right next to the king. If you then sin against the king, the sinning is more severe and the punishment is immediate. So this is what they realized, and they probably saw that by the sin of the golden calf too. But now, by the misonanim, where again it happened, they already started saying to themselves that this state of living this kind of miraculous state is a bit too much for them. They already subconsciously yearned for being more in a natural state, where things aren't as severe, things aren't as sudden and as severe as what they experienced. And that, he says, is what led to the sin of the spies. So there's a big discussion when you get to Parshas Haloscha. We're traversing a lot of the book of Bamidbar here, plus part of Bereshis. The Jewish people asked for spies, which we don't find in Parshas Shalach. It's explicit in Parshas Devarim when Moshe repeats the story of the spies. And there's discussion amongst the commentaries. Was it wrong to ask for spies? Was it not wrong? Some say it's not wrong because that's how you go to war. From Rashi, it sounds like that Rashi follows as the opinion of the Medrash that it wasn't right for them to send the spies. Says the Netziv that it really depends. If you're living in a miraculous state, you don't need spies. You don't need to approach war in the regular way. But because the Jewish people themselves already were yearning for a more natural state, they asked for spies. When you deal in a natural way, in a natural war, you send out spies first. And once the Jewish people already were, in a certain way, now lowering their standard, Hashem says, okay, so send spies. At the end of the day, even after sending spies, they should have still retained their trust in Hashem when the spies came back. But at the same time, the spies come back and they say, these people are unconquerable, and you're in a state of mind, or at least in your subconscious, they're in a state of mind where they want to live natural. Well, then big, huge, strong people are not conquerable. They should have even so because they were still living with miracles and knowing Hashem's promise to them, what Hashem had done for them. They should have realized that even in this state, Hashem can save them. But what happened to them was that once they started yearning for that change, for that transition too early, the sin of the spies came up. That's when the sin of the spies happened. And therefore Hashem said, you got to stay in the desert for another 40 years. If they would have remained in that state of miracles, they could have gone into Eretz Yisrael, continuing the miraculous conquering of Eretz Yisrael, greater than the miracles that they had when they had to fight the war. That's how I understand what the Nitzid means. The wars they fought later were miraculous too, but they were natural wars. It would have been a whole different story if they would have on their own remained in that state of miracles. Now they didn't. They fell. And now they had to stay there. The next generation had to stay in the desert another 40 years, living miraculous existence. So that now when they would enter the land of Israel, they'd be ready. They would be ready with all the experiences that they had with the miracles to take those experiences and lessons and carry it into their natural lives. But but they couldn't do it after the sin of the spies. After the sin of the spies, where they already were accepting a natural existence, and they fell, they now needed another 38 years of miraculous living to make it clear to them Hashem's presence and Hashem's omnipotence, and that Hashem runs the world, to then take that into the land of Israel with them. So the book of Bamidbar is the transition of the Jewish people from a miraculous state of living to a natural state of living. That transition is represented in the countings, in the countings that happened. The one that happened at the beginning of this week's parsha, the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, and what happened at the end. And therefore, it's called the Chomesh HaPekudim, the book of the Chumash of countings, which really means it's the Chumash of the transition of the Jewish people from the state of miracles to a state of living naturally. Thank you for listening. Have a good night. Chodesh Tov.